GoldenEye was unlike anything on consoles before it. With its arsenal of iconic weapons, minute-to-learn gameplay, and let's call them unique graphics, what started as a rail shooter tie-in developed by Rare exploded home console FPS multiplayer into a phenomenon, and ignited a love for Bond in a generation of new fans. However, since its release, one of the most iconic shooters of all time remained exclusive to the Nintendo 64, trapped in a complicated web of licenses and relationships between monolithic stakeholders. For a long time, it seemed unlikely that GoldenEye in its original form would ever truly see a release on modern consoles. But that didn't stop developers from trying. By my count, there have been 11 attempts to recapture that GoldenEye charm with reimaginings, remakes, and spiritual successors. With us finally getting to see it on the Nintendo Switch and the Series X over 25 years after its original release, it's time we look at every attempt at a GoldenEye 2. The team at Rare was sick of James Bond. It was understandable. The 2-year development of GoldenEye had been tough on the team, and when approached by Nintendo to develop a tie-in to the next film, Tomorrow Never Dies, they would decline, moving instead to expand their first-person shooter ideas beyond what the franchise could do. Nintendo, however, would enter discussions with MGM regardless, intending to continue their exclusive relationship with the license, but would be dramatically outbid by Electronic Arts. As a result, the future of GoldenEye successors would be split directly down the middle, those that existed within the world of Bond, and those developed by the team that worked on the original. The Rare team would enter into production on Perfect Dark, a title that came from a random name generator featuring an aesthetic inspired by Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, and episodes of The X-Files that were on at the time. It was designed first and foremost to do what Rare did best, push Nintendo consoles to their absolute limit. And being one of 5 games to require the expansion pack to get the full experience, that definitely shows. Perfect Dark in a lot of ways is the purest example of a GoldenEye 2, refining its textures and adding things its predecessor was lacking, such as voice acting, but maintaining that unique feel and the odd quirks it had, like the diegetic pause menu and that trademark waggly aiming. There's a shine to it, not just in aesthetics, that comes from a team that feels much more comfortable in the game that was being developed. It's iterative, but manages to still feel unique compared to what was done before, and showcase the team's personality in a way that feels free from the looming eye of massive corporations, letting Perfect Dark become one of Rare's most iconic IPs, alongside Killer Instinct and Battletoads. The anticipation around the game was high, however. While GoldenEye had been a fairly slow burn to become the phenomenon it was, Perfect Dark was hotly anticipated as the coming gamers game. Despite massive shakeups and departures in the already relatively small team that will become more relevant later, Perfect Dark would release in May of 2000, missing its planned 1999 release date, but still managing to impress players. What it lacked in the prestige of the Bond license, it made up for in creating an experience unlike any other. The team at Rare was agile, and Perfect Dark is a game that's feature-rich. The display of ideas here feels like a team in their absolute prime, trying to make the definitive console shooter, experimenting with new and weird things that made for something that separates it from its contemporaries not only on the N64, but anywhere else. On the other side of the split, Electronic Arts would move away from the first-person shooter for their PS1 exclusive tie-in to Tomorrow Never Dies, enlisting Black Ops Entertainment to create a frankly clunky third-person shooter. However, when moving forward for Brosnan's third film, The World Is Not Enough, Electronic Arts would be approached by Eurocom, who had been developing a next-gen first-person shooter engine that they felt would be perfect for Bond. As a result, The World Is Not Enough is the second 007 game to release on the N64, and one of the first-person shooters to follow GoldenEye. After the disappointment of Tomorrow Never Dies and the stiff competition from Perfect Dark, all eyes were on Eurocom to deliver. It's interesting then, looking at interviews from the time, how little influence they seem to draw from Rare. And despite their relative similarity in appearance, playing them both makes that kind of obvious. The World Is Not Enough is much more focused on being a successful tie-in to the film, rather than creating fun levels that encourage replayability. In its favor, that means better, more dynamic objectives and cinematic moments. But it's not the endlessly replayable shooting gallery that GoldenEye was, and lacks that same unique rare shooter charm that Perfect Dark maintained. In a very short list of N64 FPSs, The World Is Not Enough would certainly be close to the top, but that speaks more to the lack of quality and quantity in its contemporaries than its own ability to stand out. For me personally, however, this was the only Bond game we owned on N64 growing up, and levels like King's Ransom cemented that unique feeling of Brosnan's MI6 into a core piece of my love for the franchise as a whole. And implementing bots in its multiplayer gave it something that a borrowed copy of GoldenEye couldn't give me: enough friends to play deathmatch with at any given time. But revisiting it so far from its release date, it's hard to imagine a situation where you need to play it beyond nostalgia or being a die-hard James Bond fan. Its greatest strength is its legacy, riding the ship for EA's Bond run and being a humble beginning to their next-generation golden age. Over at Rare during development of Perfect Dark, David Doak and Steve Ellis, alongside a handful of the GoldenEye and Perfect Dark team, would depart the project and begin making moves towards forming their own studio, Free Radical Design. FRD would start work almost immediately on an original third-person shooter under the working title Redemption, which would eventually become Second Sight. However, after learning of a potential gap in the PS2 launch window, they realized it was best to develop something a little less complicated that could meet the fall 2000 deadline. That came in the form of Time Splitters in October, less than 6 months after the release of Perfect Dark, a game designed to recapture their work on the multiplayer side of GoldenEye with only the loosest single-player campaign connecting a variety of fantastical maps, characters, and weapons. Time Splitters multiplayer is very impressive, and while AI bots feel a little clunky, its focus on capturing genre film cliches in this form makes for an over-the-top version of what GoldenEye was doing, while still capturing the unique quirks that came with this era of shooters. Even its single-player campaign, with its linear levels that involve getting to the end and racing back to the starting point, feel reminiscent of GoldenEye's roots as a rail shooter. The game as a whole is its predecessor's purest ideas boiled down to a concentrated vision, with very few frills or flash, likely due in part to Free Radical being a small team learning how to develop for a new console. As a result, David Doak and team would have a good foundation to develop their sequel on, and with the success of the first game, Free Radical would also be able to grow into a team of about 30. Even with a fairly quick turnaround of 23 months, the team would have more time and more staff to improve on what was done on the first game, while also doing what they did with GoldenEye but bigger. The influence from the team's early work is really clear, with great recreations of the Dam and pieces of Severnaya. It's obvious the team was growing up from their origins at Rare, and their love for genre films beyond Bond only seemed to be growing as well. As David Doak put it,
personally, I think the best thing Free Radical did was Time Splitters 2. That was the high point for the company. It was the game that was most like what we wanted to do. Given infinite resources, it's what we would have done more of.
And it's hard to disagree. Time Splitters 2 is all spectacle, fleshing out its story with a similar series of time travel vignettes that feel both more committed to their respective genres, but also just bigger. And with added optional objectives and levels that are comfortable moving through a large variety of areas, it's hard to not compare it to something like a theme park dark ride, or again a B-movie you catch late at night on cable. But despite being bigger, it still maintains that GoldenEye pedigree, offering a slightly tweaked version of its aiming and a similar type and structure of objectives. While I'm not sure if I would personally call it better than GoldenEye or Perfect Dark, it no longer feels like it's trying to sit within that wheelhouse, offering that cartoony aesthetic and a strong enough creative vision to really stand on its own. While a lot of games we'll look at will be better versions of what GoldenEye was, this one is more than anything just a good game. And that really counts for something when you're an independent studio like Free Radical. With the success of their sequel, the team would be approached by Electronic Arts for their next game, Time Splitters Future Perfect. But EA still had their hands on the Bond license, and that was bound to cause some conflict. But first, a detour. In this era, Bond games would become focused on telling their own original stories rather than being direct adaptations. While these would still be first-person shooters until EA Redwood Shores' Everything or Nothing, these games' connection to GoldenEye are relatively tenuous. In an effort to keep this from being a retrospective of Bond games as a whole, Eurocom's Nightfire is probably the most relevant. It most feels like a successor to their work on The World Is Not Enough, going as far as to reuse animations and show off their original next-gen engine that got them the license in the first place. However, it's worth pointing out just how similar levels like Countdown feel to GoldenEye missions, using a similar missile silo aesthetic and creating corridors that closely resemble the Archangelus facility. Also in its multiplayer, Nightfire would go beyond just using its original characters to once again feature a wide range of heroes and villains from the Bond catalog, with the return of staples like Oddjob and Jaws, and adding new ones that were guaranteed to get you accused of cheating at a sleepover such as Knick Knack. However, it wouldn't be until Brosnan's departure from the role that another game named GoldenEye would find its way to home consoles, this time with a new subtitle, Rogue Agent. GoldenEye Rogue Agent reminds me of a lot of games, but GoldenEye 64 isn't really one of them. Without the thin veneer of the Bond license, its main mechanics most remind me of Halo 2's mix and match dual wield, which really hits the nail on the head. While Rogue Agent would release only 13 days after Halo 2 in 2004, its lead designer Dan Orzulok had been with Bungie until 2002, working most prominently on the Level 2 betrayals in Halo 1. And heading up with the EA Los Angeles team who had developed the stellar Medal of Honor frontline, it's hard to not have high expectations for Rogue Agent. And credit where credit's due, a lot of these ideas are very good on paper, with traps to detonate and an impressive arsenal of weaponry to combat enemies that use a proprietary AI system designed around emotional responses. In execution, however, things start to feel a little clunky. Weapon inventory management never feels like the trade-off it should, oftentimes resulting in stopping forward momentum to awkwardly swap guns laying on the ground. And the GoldenEye, the game's only gadget, despite having a variety of functions, never feels as useful as just shooting an enemy until at least the late game. Even its traps and hazards are oftentimes so far spread out, or part of missions that feel so long that they mostly feel like an afterthought. A lot of games feel, look, and borrow very heavily from the original GoldenEye, but the first one to share its name seems afraid of comparisons being made. It's odd. Beyond dual wield, which was by no means the main gimmick of the original, and again its paper-thin plot involving a conflict between two iconic Bond villains, it's hard to feel comfortable with this game sharing its name. It feels like EA struggling with what to do with the Bond license while in between actors, and making a very awkward attempt to cash in on the brand recognition of a game they had no involvement in, and had no interest in adapting, remaking, or updating. What's also odd is how the project would directly influence the success of the next TimeSplitters title. With Free Radical moving away from Eidos to a new relationship with Electronic Arts, the team would set out to develop their third and final installment in their flagship franchise with Future Perfect. During development, Rogue Agent was not looking impressive, but with the brand recognition of the GoldenEye name, EA's projections were looking on it more favorably than the new TimeSplitters. While the margins between the two projects were thin, EA would move to heavily promote and market the obviously inferior new GoldenEye, rather than a game that was being developed by the original team. And when taking a look at both games in hindsight, even without judging them based on which is the better GoldenEye 2, the mistake is obvious. EA's influence on the Future Perfect project can be felt from the very beginning, encouraging the team to include a more traditional protagonist rooted in action heroes of the time such as Vin Diesel and Wesley Snipes' Blade, resulting in a more fleshed out version of the player character from TimeSplitters 2, Cortez, who, despite the publisher's request, remained in line with the more comedic approach the series was known for.
It's time to split!
Right, whatever.
That also came with a more fleshed out story, featuring a rotating cast of new and returning side characters alongside another journey through time. It's a balance of quality gameplay and self-proclaimed lazy sci-fi attitude that EA never quite understood, making for confusing messages in marketing and a larger focus on pushing games that were easier to sell. Despite it not falling in line with market trends, that doesn't stop Future Perfect from being arguably the best TimeSplitters game, and most definitely the most modern feeling of the three, showing a studio that's grown beyond making GoldenEye-inspired shooters to great single and multiplayer FPSs. Being the last TimeSplitters game we'd get, at least until word on the Deep Silver project becomes more tangible, it feels like a very good note to go out on, even despite EA's influence. On the Rare side of things, a sequel to Perfect Dark had been in development as far back as their days under Nintendo. But after moving the project to the first Xbox after their buyout from Microsoft, and then to it becoming a 360 launch title, their goal was to make a modern multiplayer FPS with that trademark Rare charm. In November of 2005, Microsoft and Rare would release Perfect Dark Zero, the third first-person shooter on the Xbox 360. Following only Call of Duty 2, and Peter Jackson's King Kong: the official game of the movie. With the studio still recovering from their split with the Free Radical founders, and with a development cycle that took, as some developers put it, 3,000 years, it was no surprise that the game failed to live up to expectations. Perfect Dark Zero is a game clearly caught in between being a successor to the original and being forced to exist in the post-Halo console FPS boom, making decisions that feel both dated and overly cinematic in ways that combine together into something sluggish and awkward feeling. Enemies react to being shot in a similar way they did in Perfect Dark and GoldenEye, but more often than not, it fails to communicate properly to the player whether or not they're defeated, and instead is over-designed to look impressive and show off the new tech. And while it has a similar, more cartoony art style as Time Splitters, here with its generic-feeling cyberpunk trappings and extreme turn-of-the-millennium fashion, it ends up looking muddy, awkward, and frankly like a mix between The Matrix and a Kmart brand Spice Girls. To some people that may be a strength, but for me personally, it makes for one of the least charming looking and playing FPSs of this era. There's no inherent benefit in returning to this for nostalgia's sake, or anything beyond a reminder of the growing pains first-person shooters were going through at the start of the 7th generation. After the release of Perfect Dark Zero, rumors began to circulate that Rare was working on a remake of GoldenEye, and that fans would soon be slapping their way across HD versions of the original's levels very soon. However, this would not happen. Development on Rare's GoldenEye remake would begin in the wake of the original Rare founders Chris and Tim Stamper leaving the studio in 2007. Without the insulation they provided from Microsoft, the plug would be pulled on a prototype for an MMO. After a call from former Nintendo and current Microsoft producer Ken Lobb about Nintendo's own re-release of the original, Microsoft and Rare were offered the chance to do what they wanted with GoldenEye on the Xbox. With that small MMO team and the intention of giving the new Xbox Live Arcade digital storefront its first hit, the original company that worked on GoldenEye would start on their remake in March of 2007. Their intention was to stay as true to the original as they could, starting with the original source code and reworking the graphics. By the developer's own admission, their work was simple and straightforward, being the self-proclaimed easiest project the studio had worked on. While it remained mostly under wraps, its leaked build would show just that. A high-res, slightly improved version of a classic game that was still clearly running the original underneath. And after games like Rogue Agent, that definitely feels like a positive. It's not trying to erase the past, instead offering what was there before with a slightly better coat of paint. And even then, it was purely optional, offering the ability to switch graphics at any point, and beating out the Halo Anniversary ports that would popularize that feature by a few years. Despite the project only having a few bugs left before the entire game was finished, the plug was pulled in late 2007. Common theory regarding GoldenEye's lack of a modern re-release typically points to the Bond rights holder Eon Productions, their UK affiliate Danjaq, and /or their parent company MGM. They are very serious about their licensing, going as far as to always insist that the current on-screen Bond is the sole person to portray the character in outside media, with very few exceptions. It's safe to assume that, when the XBLA project went under, its usage of Pierce Brosnan as Bond rather than the current Daniel Craig would be one of the main reasons. However, in an interview with Rare developers Mark Edmonds and Chris Tilson, we learned that the project was instead canceled by an unnamed Nintendo executive, who persuaded the company to end the project despite support from other board members. It's unclear who at Nintendo was responsible, despite it being rumored that it was former president Hiroshi Yamauchi. But having Microsoft releasing a product that was once exclusive on a Nintendo console, pushing it as the killer app to their digital storefront as Nintendo was in the midst of launching their own, doesn't sound very good for business. And it being Rare, a studio they once owned a controlling stake in, didn't help either. But that wouldn't stop the full project from being leaked in 2021, offering a look at an internal closed beta build of the game, showcasing its new graphics. Despite minor changes to actors for licensing regions and the removal of some references to former Rare employees, most prominently Dr. Doak, the project is extremely faithful to the original. Unlike a lot of remakes and successors so far, this one most feels like the one worth returning to, offering a modern enough experience and controls while still capturing that key GoldenEye experience, warts and all. Statue is still incredibly dark, hostages still like to get shot, and the Klob is still pretty terrible. But it feels like GoldenEye, and looks the way you remember it through rose-tinted glasses. Had it come out, this would more than likely be the definitive version, offering online multiplayer and slightly tweaked controls, and not completely forgetting its legacy like with Rogue Agent, or pushing it too far into the modern like with the next game, GoldenEye Reloaded. On the Nintendo side of things, the project would be pushed in a different direction, announcing their goals to bring the original to the Wii Virtual Console before work on the XBLA remake would begin in 2006. At this time, however, the license to Bond games had fallen into the hands of Activision. When the plug would be pulled on the XBLA project and their own goals for GoldenEye would shift away from Virtual Console, Nintendo and Activision would instead move to make a full, ground-up remake of GoldenEye for the Wii. Initial negotiations would start with Free Radical, who after moving away from Timesplitters, were faced with the failure of their Halo killer Haze and the cancellation of Star Wars Battlefront 3. With a future that was looking increasingly bleak, a chance to return to GoldenEye was a glimmer of hope. After developing a new playable version of The Dam, however, negotiations with Activision would go silent, and the publisher would move away from Free Radical in late 2008. Likely as a result of this, FRD would be forced into administration by Christmas that year. Development would instead fall in the hands of the World Is Not Enough developer Eurocom, who had most recently worked with Activision on the PS2 version of Quantum of Solace, and according to some producers, had approached the publisher directly with their pitch in a very similar way to how they'd gotten the job for their own N64 Bond game almost 10 years prior. GoldenEye Wii would be released in November of 2010. While it would be lauded as the top of a relatively short list of Wii-exclusive first-person shooters, it would only be a year until Activision would re-release the game on 360 and PS3 as GoldenEye Reloaded. The changes are relatively minor, and for sake of clarity, Reloaded is what we'll focus on the most. Despite the name, Reloaded probably feels both the furthest and the closest to what GoldenEye was. While it maintains many of the same levels and even objectives, going as far as to add more when raising difficulty, it makes basically no attempt to remind players of the N64 original from a gameplay perspective, more closely resembling first-person shooters of the time. Gone is the wobbly aiming, or levels that reward replayability, or even guns named things like Klob, instead replacing it with straightforward shooting galleries and common tropes of the time, making for a game that feels more stuck in its time period than the original ever did despite itself. That isn't to say Reloaded is a bad game. Even when comparing it to games that share the name GoldenEye, Reloaded is most definitely in the top 2/3 of a list featuring 3 titles, but its commitment to modernizing the GoldenEye movie makes it suffer. While again, Eon's restriction on what actors portray Bond is still at play, the choice to fit the source material into the personality of Daniel Craig as well makes for a game that feels like a tie-in to a version of the GoldenEye movie that never released, rather than something designed to recapture that feeling of nostalgia. Fan-favorite characters feel so far off from their original counterparts that it's hard to not be reminded of their original versions in both the source material and the original game. However, for players looking for a more modern take on the franchise and games, it's a solid offering, being among the best of the Activision Bond games, standing alongside the wonderful 007 Bloodstone, and head and shoulders over Eurocom's next title, 007 Legends. In a world where both this and the XBLA project were released, a lot of the major problems this game has would be alleviated. But after seeing what Rare had to offer, it's hard to not be disappointed. Which explains why, after this point, fans began to take matters into their own hands. First came GoldenEye Source, a full conversion mod into Valve's Source engine targeted directly at the multiplayer experience. While it started development in 2005, it would release 1.0 in 2010, with a small team of developers working in the memory of the original founder Nixter Bishop, who passed away in 2006. The project would continue to get updates until 2016, with a version 5.0 that garnered the project mainstream attention and a dedicated player base. It's more than anything a testament to the quality of work being done in the community, being not only a very impressive recreation of GoldenEye multiplayer in a way that feels very similar to the likes of something like Counter-Strike, but also going beyond to recreate more iconic locations from other Bond films such as the titular Casino Royale. It's free, and probably the easiest way to play GoldenEye multiplayer on PC in a way that feels surprisingly authentic. It's been a long time since I've gotten slapped to death, and it's nice to be able to do it in HD without sitting on a floor covered in Cheeto dust and Jurassic Park sleeping bags. In 2016, one level designer on Source, Ben Coakley, would make the move to Unreal and begin work on GoldenEye 25 with a small handful of developers from the Source project. This time, however, the focus was on the single player, with the goal of releasing the game for free on the 25th anniversary in August of 2022. Danjaq and MGM would move in to cease and desist the project in 2020. While what was seen in the project was impressive, the team would instead create a new title, this time an original IP named Spies Don't Die. Updates on the project were posted frequently for about a year after its announcement, featuring inside looks at both the game itself and the original score from composer Yannick Zinhausen. The project, however, has been quiet since June of 2021, with very few updates from the team since. Despite this, another project would be shown off at the PC Game Show in May of 2022, with a similar name, Agent 64 Spies Never Die, this time recapturing the essence of rare FPSs in the Unity engine and releasing a demo on Steam. What showcased is something very impressive, if not somewhat more closely resembling Perfect Dark's first level. Guns feel punchy, and the objectives change with difficulty in a similar way. Development seems to be ongoing, with no release date currently announced. Rumors of a GoldenEye re-release on modern hardware began to once again circle in late 2021, citing a German list of games banned from being advertised to children. Despite games falling off that list after 25 years, the original GoldenEye had been removed almost exactly a year before that, likely at the request of either Nintendo, Microsoft, or MGM, giving fans hope that it would appear as one of the N64 games featured in Nintendo Switch's online expansion pack. After achievements would be discovered and leaks would be all but confirmed to Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb throughout 2022, a Nintendo Direct in September would finally confirm that GoldenEye was coming to Switch, with Xbox announcing it for console Game Pass and Rare Replay the same day, both with the release of January 2023. While having the game on modern consoles was exciting, this was not the XBLA version. Upon initial release, members of the community began to notice missing audio tracks, misaligned visual textures, and broken collision and hitboxes. Beyond that, it was also a very bare-bones port, still running at 30 FPS and lacking online multiplayer but only for the Xbox version. Images of a new era of world peace by way of solving every dispute by 1v1ing and facility slappers only quickly began to fade. And after waiting for a new release for so long, it's hard to not think about what could have been. While GoldenEye was unlike anything on consoles before it, looking at its successors, it's hard to not notice that it was also unlike anything after it. For over 25 years, developers have attempted to recreate, remaster, or follow in the footsteps of what came before. The best GoldenEye successors are, more often than not, the original developers working to recapture what was there before, but build beyond it, creating original-feeling games in a market and genre that was becoming increasingly formulaic. Even Perfect Dark Zero, a game that wasn't particularly fun to play, at least tried to be something different. But it's hard to not wonder what the future of GoldenEye's legacy looks like. With the game freely available on modern consoles, albeit in an inferior form, will it still continue to influence new developers? And with both Bond games and Perfect Dark likely going third person with IO Interactive and Crystal Dynamics respectively, how will they incorporate that legacy into the future?